Mali and Burkina Faso have said they're imposing a travel ban on US citizens. That's after an equivalent measure announced by the Trump administration.
For years, global power moved in one direction. Washington decided. Others adjusted. Borders closed, visas were denied, and entire nations were quietly placed on the wrong side of mobility, with little room to respond. But at the end of December 2025, that pattern cracked. When the United States, under President Donald Trump, expanded its visa restrictions to include Mali and Burkina Faso, the expectation was familiar: muted anger, diplomatic notes, and eventual acceptance. Instead, something unexpected happened. Both West African governments answered back calmly, legally, and without hesitation by banning U.S. nationals from entering their countries. It was not an emotional outburst. It was not a symbolic protest. It was a calculated act rooted in one principle: reciprocity. And in a world where visa power has long been one-sided, that single decision turned a routine immigration move into a geopolitical moment that many in Washington did not see coming. But why is it happening? Let's find out. For years, visa bans followed a predictable rhythm. A powerful country announced restrictions. A list of names appeared. A justification was issued, including security, data gaps, and risk assessment. And then, quietly, life went on. The affected countries protested if they had to, complained if they dared, and ultimately adjusted. The imbalance was so normal that it stopped being noticed. That is why what happened in late December 2025 felt so jarring. There was no dramatic press conference in Washington, no emergency summit, just a policy update from the United States expanding travel restrictions to 20 additional countries. For American audiences, it blended into the background noise of border control debates. Another line item in a long-running immigration crackdown under President Donald Trump. But thousands of miles away in West Africa, the decision landed with a different weight. Buried in that expanded list were Mali and Burkina Faso, two countries already under intense international scrutiny, already navigating sanctions, aid suspensions, and diplomatic isolation after military takeovers. To Washington, the ban was framed as technical and preventative. To Bamako and Ouagadougou, it read like a verdict. Not against governments, against people. Entire populations were suddenly grouped under suspicion. No individual assessments, no differentiation between students, professionals, families, or officials. Just a blanket assumption: we do not trust what we cannot fully control. Still, even that was not what made this moment extraordinary. Countries across the world have been placed on similar lists before. Many are far larger, many are far louder, and almost all responded the same way, by absorbing the decision. Mali and Burkina Faso did not absorb it. Within days, something unusual began circulating, not through leaks or speculation, but through official government channels. Carefully worded statements, legal language, no emotion, no insults. Just one principle repeated with precision: reciprocity. If Malian and Burkinabe citizens were barred from entering the United States, then U.S. citizens would now be barred from entering Mali and Burkina Faso. Same logic, same treatment, same result. For American passport holders accustomed to near-universal access, this was a shock. The question wasn't about tourism or inconvenience. It was about expectation. For decades, access flowed one way. This decision interrupted that flow. And that interruption mattered far beyond visas, because it suggested that some governments in West Africa were no longer willing to accept global hierarchies as fixed. That they were prepared to respond to exclusion not with silence, but with symmetry. And that even in areas long dominated by Western leverage, borders, mobility, and legitimacy, the rules could be challenged. So the real puzzle isn't that Mali and Burkina Faso reacted. The real puzzle is this: what exactly did the United States do that convinced them silence was no longer an option? Because from Washington's point of view, nothing extraordinary had happened at all. On December 16th, the administration of President Donald Trump announced an expansion of existing U.S. travel restrictions. 20 additional countries were added to the list. There was no special briefing for West Africa, no singled-out press statement. Mali and Burkina Faso were folded into a broader policy move that officials described as necessary, technical, and overdue. The official justification followed a familiar script. US authorities said they lacked sufficient information to properly assess the risks posed by travelers from certain countries. Ongoing instability, weak documentation systems, and the presence of armed groups were highlighted as concerns. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, designed to make the decision sound administrative rather than political. For domestic audiences, the move fit neatly into a wider tightening of immigration controls. In the weeks prior, the administration had pointed repeatedly to the November 26 shooting of 2 National Guard members in Washington, D.C. That incident was used to reinforce a broader narrative. America was under threat, borders were too porous, and caution had to override convenience. From that angle, adding Mali and Burkina Faso to a long list of restricted countries appeared almost automatic. Both nations are struggling with insecurity. Both are governed by military juntas. Both have distanced themselves from Western-backed regional frameworks, including their uneasy break with the economic community of West African states. In Washington's internal logic, they fit the profile. But this is where perception diverged sharply. What the US treated as a generic security measure, Bamako and Ouagadougou interpreted as a political judgment. The ban did not target specific failures or individuals. It did not name reforms that could reverse it. It simply placed entire populations behind a wall with no clear path out. To Malian and Burkinabe officials, that mattered, because it suggested that regardless of internal changes, cooperation, or intentions, their citizens were now categorized as inherently suspect. The decision carried an implicit message: instability equals exclusion, and exclusion requires no negotiation. That sense of finality is what changed the reaction. Had the ban come with consultations, timelines, or conditional benchmarks, it might have been absorbed like previous restrictions. Instead, it arrived as a fait accompli, announced, justified, and closed. And there was another detail Washington underestimated. This expansion came at a moment when Mali and Burkina Faso were already redefining their external relationships, asserting control over security policy, and openly rejecting what they saw as Western double standards. In that context, the visa decision didn't feel neutral. It felt like confirmation that disengagement was already underway and that dignity would not be preserved by staying quiet. Which brings us to the critical shift. If the US saw this as routine, why did Mali and Burkina Faso decide that responding normally was no longer acceptable? Because silence this time would have meant accepting a permanent downgrade. For Mali and Burkina Faso, the US visa decision didn't land in a vacuum. It landed after years of watching their security situation deteriorate under arrangements that were heavily influenced, sometimes outright designed by Western partners. Foreign military missions came with promises of stabilization, intelligence sharing, and regional coordination. What followed instead was the steady spread of armed groups, collapsing rural control, and growing public anger. By the time military governments took power in Mali and Burkina Faso, much of the population no longer believed that silence, patience, or compliance brought protection or respect. The junta justified their takeovers with one core argument: the old way of managing insecurity, especially under external supervision, had failed. That context matters because when Washington imposed a blanket travel ban, it didn't just restrict movement. It implicitly assigned blame, not to policies, not to specific institutions, but to people. Students, professionals, families, officials, and everyone were grouped into a single risk category. No individual review, no explanation of what would count as improvement, no indication that cooperation would change anything. The message, as read in Bamako and Ouagadougou, was brutally simple. You are a problem, and we don't need to explain why. In previous years, that kind of decision might have been swallowed. Governments would issue statements, ambassadors would be summoned, and the public would be told this was unfortunate but unavoidable. But these are not previous years. The current leaderships in Mali and Burkina Faso came to power explicitly rejecting the idea that legitimacy flows from Western approval. Their political survival depends not on pleasing Washington, but on demonstrating strength, control, and dignity at home. Accepting a collective ban without response would have contradicted everything they claimed to stand for. There was also a strategic calculation. If the United States had already decided to restrict mobility and distance itself, then restraint offered no advantage. Silence would not reopen doors. It would only confirm a hierarchy in which decisions are imposed and absorbed. So instead of negotiating quietly, both governments chose clarity. They framed their response not as retaliation, but as principle. Reciprocity stripped the dispute of emotion and exposed its logic. If insecurity justifies exclusion, then exclusion applies equally. If lack of trust blocks entry, then trust must be mutual. This approach served two purposes at once. Internationally, it challenged the assumption that visa power belongs exclusively to Western states. Domestically, it signaled to citizens that their governments would not accept humiliation as the cost of engagement. And crucially, it shifted the burden of discomfort. Suddenly, it was not only West Africans adjusting to restricted mobility. American nationals used to frictionless access were now part of the equation. That shift is what made silence impossible. But why did Mali and Burkina Faso choose reciprocity specifically, instead of symbolic protests or prolonged negotiations? Because reciprocity does something protests never do. It removes the illusion of hierarchy. When Mali and Burkina Faso issued their bans, they didn't shout. They didn't accuse. They didn't moralize. Their foreign ministries released short, almost sterile statements. The language mattered. It was legal, procedural, calm. This was not a tantrum. It was a switch being flipped. By choosing reciprocity, both governments avoided the weakness that often comes with outrage. Protests can be ignored. Angry speeches fade. Sanctions complaints get buried. Reciprocity, however, forces interaction. It compels the other side to feel the policy it has imposed. That was the point. Visa power has always functioned as a silent hierarchy. Some passports open doors automatically. Others invite suspicion by default. For decades, American passport holders moved across West Africa with minimal friction. Aid workers, diplomats, contractors, journalists, access was assumed, rarely questioned. That assumption created leverage, visibility, and influence without needing formal control. Reciprocity disrupted that assumption overnight. Suddenly, entry was no longer automatic. Movement required permission. Presence required justification. And for the first time, American nationals experienced the same uncertainty routinely faced by citizens of weaker states. This was not accidental. Reciprocity allowed Mali and Burkina Faso to say, without saying it, if you treat mobility as a privilege, then privilege must be mutual. It exposed the asymmetry of visa regimes by making them symmetrical. It also shielded them from accusations of emotional politics. They didn't ban Americans because they were angry. They banned Americans because the United States had established a rule, and they applied it back. That framing matters internationally. It places the burden of escalation not on Bamako or Ouagadougou, but on the logic of the original decision. There was another reason reciprocity was chosen over negotiation. Negotiations imply that the door is still open, that conditions can be met, and that approval might return. But the US ban came without benchmarks. No list of reforms, no pathway back, just exclusion. In that environment, negotiating looks like begging for clarity that may never come. Reciprocity, by contrast, assumes finality and responds accordingly. It also played well domestically. Military governments survive on credibility. Showing restraint while citizens are collectively barred would have weakened that credibility. Responding with equal treatment reinforced the image of governments that act, not plead. And finally, reciprocity sent a message beyond the United States. It signaled to other African and global South states that visa regimes are not sacred, that access can be regulated from both ends, and that sovereignty does not end at the airport counter. But Washington insists that all of this is secondary to one issue: security. So if reciprocity is about power and dignity, how does it collide with the US argument that this was simply about safety? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because when Washington says this is about security, it is only telling half the story. There is no dispute that Mali and Burkina Faso face serious armed group violence. Entire regions have been destabilized. Civilians have been displaced. Attacks have continued despite years of international involvement. On paper, the US argument sounds reasonable. Instability creates risk, and risk justifies caution. But from Bamako's and Ouagadougou's perspective, that logic collapses the moment you ask one uncomfortable question. Who presided over the period when that instability exploded? For more than a decade, Mali and Burkina Faso operated inside Western-designed security frameworks. Foreign troops, intelligence sharing, training missions, and counterinsurgent partnerships were all sold as solutions. Yet during that same period, armed groups multiplied, spread geographically, and embedded themselves deeper into local conflicts. Rural areas slipped away. Trust in civilian governments eroded. Public anger rose. When military governments eventually took power in Mali and Burkina Faso, they did so by arguing that the old model had failed, and that continuing it would only prolong the damage. Whether one agrees with that claim or not, it is central to how these governments understand responsibility. That is why the US visa ban feels to them less like protection and more like blame transfer. The ban does not target armed actors. It does not disrupt militant financing. It does not improve intelligence. It restricts students, business people, families, officials, and people with no connection to violence. It punishes civilians for conditions they did not create and cannot individually control. From the Sahelian viewpoint, this is where the security narrative weakens. If instability is the justification, then why are those living under that instability treated as suspects rather than partners? Why is insecurity framed as a reason for exclusion rather than a shared failure to be corrected? There is also a timing issue. The visa restrictions arrived just as Mali and Burkina Faso were asserting greater control over their security policy, rejecting external oversight, and redefining their alliances. To their leadership, the message was unmistakable: distance first, explanation later. And once distance is established, trust becomes irrelevant. That is why their response avoided moral arguments. They did not say the US was wrong. They did not dispute America's right to control its borders. They accepted the logic and applied it back. If insecurity justifies restriction, then restriction must be mutual. In doing so, they forced an implicit question into the open. Is the visa ban really about safety, or is it about disengagement disguised as caution? Because if it were purely about security, pathways would exist. Conditions would be named. Benchmarks would be set. Dialogue would be ongoing. None of that happened. Which leads directly to the final issue this confrontation raises. What does this moment actually change for the future of US Sahel relations? And who now holds the leverage? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It changes the rules of expectation, and that is where the real leverage shift lies. Until now, US Sahel relations operated on an unspoken assumption. Washington decides, and West African states react. Even when decisions were unpopular or damaging, responses stayed within safe limits: statements, diplomatic notes, or quiet resentment. What Mali and Burkina Faso did broke that pattern. They demonstrated that unilateral decisions will now meet unilateral consequences. This does not mean the United States suddenly lost power in the Sahel. It still controls aid flows, financial access, sanctions architecture, and diplomatic weight. But power is not only about capacity, it is about predictability. And predictability is exactly what disrupted this moment. By responding immediately and symmetrically, Mali and Burkina Faso signaled that future US actions, visa bans, diplomatic downgrades, and symbolic exclusions will no longer be cost-free. Even if the material impact is limited, the psychological effect is not. Washington must now calculate reactions it previously assumed would not come. This matters because the Sahel is already drifting away from Western-centered frameworks. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have loosened ties with traditional partners, exited or sidelined regional mechanisms, and pursued alternative security and diplomatic alignments. In that environment, the visa ban did not isolate them. It reinforced a path they were already on. From their perspective, the response achieved several objectives at once. Domestically, it reinforced the image of governments that defend dignity rather than absorb humiliation. Regionally, it showed neighbors that defiance does not automatically lead to collapse. Internationally, it challenged the idea that mobility hierarchies are permanent. For the United States, the situation is more complicated. Reversing the ban without conditions risks looking weak. Escalating the dispute risks accelerating disengagement. Ignoring the response confirms the very imbalance the Sahelian governments are pushing back against. Every option carries a cost that did not exist before reciprocity entered the picture. This is why the episode matters beyond visas. It marks a transition from managed tension to mutual friction. The relationship is no longer defined by persuasion or partnership, but by boundaries, clear ones. Even if travel restrictions are quietly adjusted later, the memory will remain. A line has been crossed, not legally, but psychologically. Mali and Burkina Faso have shown that they are willing to accept isolation rather than symbolic submission. That willingness alters negotiations before they even begin. And perhaps the most important consequence is not what Washington thinks or does next, but what others observe. Because this confrontation is being watched closely by governments that have endured similar exclusions, by states weighing whether silence still serves them, by leaders asking whether dignity can be defended without permission. So the final question this moment leaves hanging is not about visas, or even about the United States. It is this: now that reciprocity has been proven possible, how many others will decide they no longer have to swallow the next ban quietly either? Let us know in the comment section. Will more nations join? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.